In the late autumn of 1989, the town of Harpswell, Maine, moved at the pace of the tide. Fishing boats groaned against their ropes at dawn, and by evening the harbor lights flickered on one by one, small and steady against the dark Atlantic. It was the kind of place where people waved from their porches and measured time by the turning of seasons rather than by headlines. Nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen there. Lives unfolded quietly, predictably, like pages turned with care. Evelyn Grace Harper had once loved that rhythm. At 38, she carried herself with a gentle composure that made strangers trust her almost instantly. She had warm brown eyes, thoughtful and observant, and a way of listening that made people feel heard. She volunteered at the church bazaar every spring. She baked blueberry pies for neighbors without being asked. If someone in town needed a ride to the clinic, Evelyn was often the first to offer. Thomas Michael Harper had fallen in love with her laugh when they were both barely 20. It had been bright and unguarded then, the kind of laugh that filled a room before she realized she was making a sound. By 1989, the laugh had softened. It appeared less often, but when it did, Thomas still felt the same quiet rush in his chest. Their house stood on a narrow stretch of land overlooking the water, gray shingles weathered by salt air. The kitchen was the heart of it. A wooden table scarred by years of use sat beneath a window that framed the restless sea. Most evenings, Thomas would come home from the boatyard smelling faintly of sawdust and engine oil, and Evelyn would already have supper simmering on the stove. They had been married 17 years. 5 years earlier, they had lost their only child, a baby boy who lived just long enough for them to memorize the shape of his face. The grief had arrived like a winter storm, sudden, suffocating, and impossible to reason with. Thomas had responded the only way he knew how, by working longer hours, by fixing things that could be fixed. He repaired the porch railing. He repainted the living room. He told himself that providing stability was a form of love. Evelyn had responded differently. She grew quieter. Not fragile, not hysterical, just quieter. She would stand at the kitchen sink long after the dishes were clean, staring out at the water as if waiting for it to explain something. At night, Thomas sometimes felt her awake beside him, her breathing shallow, her body turned slightly away. "You all right?" he would murmur into the dark. "I'm fine," she would answer softly. "Just thinking." He believed her. Or maybe he wanted to. In Harpswell, people did not talk about sadness in complicated terms. Grief was something you endured. You prayed. You carried on. Time would smooth the edges. That was the understanding, passed down without ever being spoken directly. Evelyn tried to carry on. She kept her routines intact. She folded laundry with careful precision. She wrote thank you notes in looping handwriting. On Sundays, she sat beside Thomas in the third pew from the front, hands folded neatly in her lap. To anyone watching, she appeared steady, dependable, composed. But inside, something unsettled had begun to take root. There were mornings when she would wake before dawn and feel a weight pressing against her chest, not sharp enough to name, not dramatic enough to justify alarm. Just a dull, persistent heaviness. She began to question small things. Whether she was still the woman Thomas had married. Whether she had failed in ways no one could see. Whether her silence was protecting him or slowly building a wall between them. Thomas noticed the quiet, but he interpreted it as healing. One evening in November, as the wind rattled the kitchen windows, he set down his fork and studied her across the table. Candlelight flickered against her face, tracing shadows beneath her eyes. "You've been tired lately," he said gently. "Maybe you should see Dr. Whitaker." Evelyn gave a faint smile. "I'm just worn out, Tom." "It's nothing." He nodded, accepting the answer. He did not press further. In his mind, love meant not pushing too hard. Later that night, Evelyn stepped out onto the back porch alone. The air smelled of salt and distant wood smoke. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and watched the tide pull away from shore. The moon cast a silver path across the water, bright and unreachable. She tried to remember what it felt like to be certain about her place in the world. To wake up without questioning whether she was enough. She loved Thomas. That had never been the problem. If anything, the steadiness of his devotion made her fear her own instability even more. Inside the house, Thomas rinsed the dinner plates and stacked them carefully in the rack. He felt grateful for the life they had built, modest, yes, but honest and secure. He believed that whatever shadow lingered between them would fade in time. From the porch, Evelyn looked back through the kitchen window. She saw her husband moving in familiar patterns, dependable and kind. A man who had never failed her. The sight filled her with both tenderness and an ache she could not explain. She did not want to leave him. She did not want to hurt him. But for the first time, a quiet, frightening thought surfaced, one she barely allowed herself to form. What if staying was slowly erasing her? The wind shifted, colder now. Evelyn closed her eyes and let it brush against her face. In the distance, a buoy bell clanged in the dark, steady and indifferent. Inside the house, the lights glowed warm and constant. From the outside, the Harper home looked peaceful. Solid. Untouched by anything extraordinary. No one in Harpswell could have guessed that beneath that calm surface, something fragile was beginning to fracture, not with noise, not with anger, but with silence. The next morning began like any other in Harpswell, cold, pale, and quietly deliberate. A thin layer of frost clung to the edges of the kitchen window, and the sea beyond the glass looked steel-gray beneath a low winter sky. The house felt still, wrapped in that early hour before the town fully stirred awake. Thomas rose first, as he always did. He shaved by habit, listening to the hum of the furnace kicking on and off. When he stepped into the kitchen, he saw Evelyn already there, standing at the stove. She had wrapped herself in her soft blue cardigan, the one she wore when the air turned sharp. A kettle was beginning to murmur on the burner. "Morning," he said, leaning down to kiss the top of her head. "Morning," she replied gently. Her voice sounded steady. Not bright, not distant. Just steady. She poured coffee into his mug and slid it toward him across the table. The gesture was familiar, practiced over years. Thomas sat down and unfolded the local paper, scanning headlines about weather warnings and a council meeting scheduled for Thursday night. For a moment, it was an ordinary morning. Evelyn moved around the kitchen with quiet efficiency. She rinsed her cup, dried her hands on a dish towel, and glanced toward the window. The tide was low. A few gulls circled near the shoreline. "I'm going to stop by McKenna's before it gets busy," she said, reaching for her purse. "We're out of flour." Thomas nodded without looking up. "All right. Drive careful. Roads might be slick." "I will." She paused near the doorway, just long enough that he sensed her presence even without lifting his eyes. When he finally did, she was watching him. Not urgently. Not dramatically. Just watching. "What?" he asked with a faint smile. "Nothing," she said, returning it. "I'll be back before lunch." He believed her. The screen door closed with its usual soft snap. Thomas heard her car engine turn over, the tires crunching lightly against gravel. Then the sound faded down the narrow road that curved past their house and toward town. He finished his coffee, rinsed the mug, and headed out to the boatyard. The morning passed without interruption. He sanded down a hull that needed refinishing and spoke briefly with a customer about replacing a motor. Around noon, as he wiped his hands on a rag, he glanced at his watch. She should have been home by now, he thought. Still, he told himself not to overthink it. Maybe she had run into someone at the store. Maybe she had decided to stop by the church office. Harpswell was small, errands often turned into conversations. By 2 o'clock, a thin unease began to settle in his chest. He called the house from the yard's office phone. It rang 4 times before rolling into silence. He hung up without leaving a message. There was no reason to. She would see he had called. At 4, the winter light had already begun to dim. Thomas drove home earlier than usual, telling himself he was being foolish. Her car wasn't in the driveway. Inside, the house felt unchanged. The morning newspaper still lay folded on the table. Her teacup sat in the sink. Her knitting basket rested in its usual place beside the sofa. Nothing appeared disturbed. He walked through each room slowly, calling her name once, then again. Ev? Only the faint hum of the refrigerator answered him. He checked the bedroom closet. Her coats hung in a neat row. Her boots were still lined up beneath them. Her jewelry box sat untouched on the dresser. The blue cardigan she had worn that morning was gone, but everything else remained. Thomas stepped back into the kitchen and stood very still. He replayed the morning in his mind, searching for something unusual. A tone in her voice. A look in her eyes. But the memory remained stubbornly ordinary. At 6, he called McKenna's general store. "Did my wife stop in this morning?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. There was a pause. "No, Tom. Haven't seen her today." The unease hardened into something colder. He drove into town, scanning the small parking lot, the side streets, the church lot. No sign of her car. He asked at the post office. At the diner. No one had seen Evelyn Harper. By the time he returned home, darkness had fully settled over the water. The porch light cast a weak circle against the frost. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, hands flat against the wood. He told himself there had to be an explanation. A stalled engine. A missed turn. A small accident somewhere along Route 24. At 9, he called the county sheriff. By 10, a deputy was standing in his living room, hat in hand, asking careful questions. Any recent arguments? No. Any reason she might have left town? No. Did she take any bags with her? She said she was buying flour. The deputy scribbled notes, his expression measured. We'll start looking first thing in the morning. After he left, the house felt cavernous. Thomas did not turn on the television. He did not sit in his usual chair. Instead, he remained at the kitchen table, staring at the empty doorway where she had stood that morning. Midnight came and went. At 2 in the morning, he rose and stepped out onto the porch. The cold cut sharply against his face. The harbor lay black and silent except for the distant clang of a buoy bell. "This isn't funny anymore, Ev," he said quietly into the dark. The wind carried his words away without reply. Inside, the clock ticked with steady indifference. The house remained intact, unchanged, holding the shape of a life that had been there just hours before. By dawn, frost had settled heavier against the windows. And Evelyn Grace Harper had not come home. By sunrise the next morning, the frost along the shoreline had hardened into a brittle crust, and the news had begun to move through Harpswell the way everything did in a small town, quietly at first, then all at once. 2 county cruisers rolled down the narrow road toward the Harper house just after 7. Their tires crunched over gravel that had not yet thawed. Thomas was already awake. He had not slept. He had remained at the kitchen table until the sky shifted from black to pale gray, listening to the clock measure out each unanswered hour. Sheriff Daniel Whitaker stepped inside with a careful, respectful tone. "Morning, Tom." Thomas nodded. His eyes were rimmed red but steady. "You find anything?" "Not yet," Whitaker replied. "We're organizing a search. We'll start with the roads between here and town." The word search landed heavily in the room. It made the absence real. Within an hour, volunteers began to gather. Neighbors pulled on heavy coats and work boots. Men from the marina brought flashlights and thermoses. Women from the church organized a list of names and phone numbers at the dining room table. The Harper house, which had been silent the night before, now hummed with controlled urgency. Thomas stood near the doorway as people moved in and out. He answered the same questions again and again. What was she wearing? Did she seem upset? Did she take anything unusual? She was wearing her blue cardigan, he said quietly. She said she was going to McKenna's. Every answer felt smaller than the question. Search teams fanned out along Route 24, scanning ditches for signs of a stalled vehicle. Others walked the tree line near the shore, their boots pressing fresh tracks into the frost. The Atlantic stretched wide and indifferent beyond them. By mid-morning, someone found Evelyn's car. It sat on the shoulder of a narrow access road half a mile outside town, parked neatly as if the driver had intended to return. The doors were unlocked. The keys were gone. Her purse rested on the passenger seat. Thomas was brought to the scene just after 11. He stepped out of the cruiser and stared at the familiar shape of the car against the pale winter light. For a brief second, relief flickered through him. The car was intact. No shattered glass. No sign of collision. Then the deeper realization settled in. If the car was here, where was Evelyn? Sheriff Whitaker approached carefully. We've checked the surrounding woods. Nothing so far. Thomas opened the driver's door and leaned inside. Her scent lingered faintly, soap and something floral. The seat was pushed back the way she liked it. The radio was off. Everything looked ordinary. Too ordinary. She wouldn't just walk away, Thomas said, more to himself than to the sheriff. Whitaker did not answer immediately. We're expanding the search radius. Word spread quickly. By afternoon, nearly 50 people were combing through wooded areas, calling her name into the still air. Evelyn. The sound echoed against bare branches and faded. The Coast Guard was notified. A small team scanned the shoreline in case she had wandered too close to the water. The tide was low, exposing rocks slick with frost. Divers stood ready, though no one wanted to voice what that might imply. Thomas remained near the access road, refusing to leave. He replayed the morning again and again. The way she had paused in the doorway. The way she had looked at him. Was there something in her eyes he had missed? By late afternoon, the light began to fade. Searchers moved more slowly now, fatigue settling into their shoulders. A volunteer approached Thomas hesitantly. We're not giving up, she assured him. We'll continue tomorrow. Tomorrow. The word felt distant and fragile. At dusk, Sheriff Whitaker asked Thomas to return home. We'll keep officers posted overnight, he said. If she comes back or if you hear from her, call immediately. Thomas nodded, though the thought of stepping back into that house felt unbearable. When he entered the kitchen, it was exactly as he had left it. The newspaper remained folded on the table. Her teacup still sat in the sink. The air inside felt warmer than the outside world, but emptier. He walked into the bedroom and opened her closet again, as if something might have changed. Her clothes hung untouched. Her suitcase remained under the bed. If she had planned to leave, she had not prepared for it. At 8 that evening, the sheriff returned with preliminary findings. No signs of struggle near the vehicle, Whitaker said carefully. No footprints leading deep into the woods that we can trace. The ground's too hard in some areas. We'll bring in tracking dogs in the morning. Thomas sat across from him, hands clasped tightly. Are you saying someone took her? We don't have evidence of foul play, Whitaker replied. But we also don't have evidence of an accident. The absence of evidence became its own weight. After the sheriff left, Thomas remained seated at the table long into the night. The house no longer felt like shelter. It felt like a place suspended in time, holding the shape of a person who was no longer there. He tried to imagine Evelyn walking away from her car voluntarily. The image refused to form clearly. She was practical. Cautious. She did not abandon errands halfway through. Outside, the buoy bell clanged steadily in the dark. The following morning, search dogs arrived. They circled the car, noses low, then tracked briefly toward the tree line before losing the scent on a stretch of frozen ground. The handler shook his head gently. It's like she disappeared. The phrase traveled through the crowd in a hushed ripple. Days passed. Posters appeared on telephone poles and storefront windows. Evelyn's photograph, taken 2 summers earlier at a church picnic, showed her smiling faintly, sunlight catching in her hair. The word missing printed in bold letters above her name felt surreal to Thomas, as though it referred to someone else. Reporters from a regional paper came and went. Questions were asked. Speculation began quietly among townspeople. Some wondered about an accident no one had yet uncovered. Others whispered possibilities they did not say aloud in front of Thomas. But there was no body. No note. No witness who had seen her leave the car. Only a vehicle parked neatly along a frozen road. By the end of the first week, official searches slowed. Resources were finite. Leads were scarce. Sheriff Whitaker sat across from Thomas once more. "We'll keep the case open," he said. "But we don't have direction right now." Thomas absorbed the words without reacting outwardly. When the house finally fell silent that evening, he stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark water. He felt suspended between two unbearable possibilities, that something terrible had happened, or that she had chosen to leave. He did not know which hurt more. Behind him, the house remained unchanged. The same dishes. The same folded newspaper. The same quiet rooms. Only Evelyn Grace Harper was missing. And in the stillness that followed the search, the absence grew louder than any sound. When the official searches slowed, the silence did not. Winter settled fully over Harpswell in the weeks that followed, covering the shoreline in hard white frost and sealing the harbor in sheets of thin ice. The volunteers stopped knocking on the Harper door each morning. The Coast Guard boats no longer circled the coast. The posters remained taped to poles and bulletin boards, but they began to curl at the edges. Life, stubborn and indifferent, resumed its pace. Thomas kept waiting. At first, he measured time in hours. Then in days. By spring, he measured it in seasons. The sheriff called periodically, always with the same careful tone. No new leads. Each time, Thomas thanked him as though gratitude might keep the case alive a little longer. Inside the house, nothing changed. Evelyn's side of the closet remained untouched. Her winter boots stood neatly beneath her coats. The knitting she had been working on that December morning lay folded in its basket, 2 needles still threaded through soft blue yarn. Thomas could not bring himself to unravel it or finish it. To complete the scarf felt like erasing the proof that she had once sat there. Neighbors came by in the early months with casseroles and quiet sympathy. They spoke gently, as if loud words might shatter something fragile in him. "You have to take care of yourself, Tom. She'd want you to." He nodded at all of it. He returned to work at the boatyard within 2 weeks of her disappearance. The rhythm of sanding wood and tightening bolts gave his hands something to do. Work did not ask questions. At night, the house expanded around him. He began leaving the porch light on until dawn. It was not a conscious decision at first. One evening he simply forgot to switch it off, and in the morning he realized he felt calmer knowing it had burned through the dark. He told himself it was practical. If she came home late, she would see it. In 1990, the first anniversary arrived quietly. No one in town mentioned it outright, but Thomas felt the date approach like a shift in the air. On December 12th, he rose before sunrise and walked down to the narrow access road where her car had been found. The gravel looked ordinary again. There was no marker to indicate what had happened there. He stood alone in the cold and tried to reconstruct the moment. Did she hesitate before stepping out of the car? Did she look back toward town? Toward home? He could not see her clearly in his mind anymore. The image blurred at the edges. As months turned into years, speculation grew softer but more pointed. Some believed she had met with an accident that had never been discovered. Others whispered that perhaps she had chosen to leave. No one voiced that theory directly to Thomas, but he saw it in the cautious way certain conversations stopped when he entered a room. One evening in the summer of 1991, his friend Mark Jensen sat with him on the back porch, watching the tide roll in. "Tom," Mark said carefully, "you ever think maybe she needed something different?" Thomas kept his eyes on the water. "Different how?" "I don't know. A change. A fresh start." Thomas's jaw tightened, though his voice remained even. "She would have told me." Mark hesitated. "Maybe she didn't know how." The words lingered long after Mark left. Thomas replayed the last months before her disappearance with increasing scrutiny. The quiet evenings. The way she sometimes drifted toward the window. He remembered asking if she was all right. He remembered accepting her answer. He began to wonder whether love, in his effort to be gentle, had become distance. In 1992, the sheriff officially reclassified the case from active search to long-term missing. The file remained open, but resources were no longer assigned daily. When Whitaker delivered the news, he did so with visible discomfort. "We're not closing it," he assured Thomas. "We just don't have direction right now." Thomas understood what that meant. The town had moved on. He tried to do the same. There were moments when anger surfaced unexpectedly. He would stand at the sink, washing dishes, and feel a flash of betrayal so sharp it startled him. How could she leave without a word? But the anger never lasted. It dissolved into confusion. Evelyn had not been impulsive. She had not been reckless. She was careful with other people's feelings, sometimes to her own detriment. If she had left voluntarily, it must have been for a reason she believed was necessary. That thought both comforted and unsettled him. In 1993, a woman from a neighboring town approached him after church. "I know it's not my place," she began, "but you're still young. You could start over." Thomas looked at her kindly. "I'm not starting over," he replied. "I'm still married." The statement felt neither stubborn nor dramatic. It was simply true to him. He did not remove his wedding ring. The house aged with him. Paint peeled slightly along the porch railing. The kitchen linoleum began to curl at one corner. He fixed what needed fixing, but he avoided major changes. Renovating felt like rewriting a chapter that was not finished. Some nights, he allowed himself to imagine two possible futures. In one, there would be a phone call. A hospital somewhere. A misunderstanding resolved. She would step back through the front door, older but intact, explaining something that would make sense once spoken aloud. In the other, there would be confirmation of something final, a body found, a letter discovered, a truth that closed the question forever. The worst possibility was the one he lived with, not knowing. By 1994, the missing posters had faded almost entirely. New flyers covered them, yard sales, community fundraisers, election notices. Evelyn's smiling photograph disappeared under layers of paper. But in the Harper kitchen, her absence remained vivid. Thomas continued speaking to her occasionally in the quiet of evening. Not in a theatrical way. Just simple phrases while rinsing dishes or locking the back door. "I fixed the railing today, Ev. The roses came back strong this year." The habit was less about belief and more about continuity. If he stopped talking, it would feel as though he had accepted an ending he did not understand. In 1995, 5 years after she vanished, the ache changed shape. It became less sharp but more permanent, like a scar that tightened in cold weather. The raw urgency of the early search was gone, replaced by something heavier, an awareness that life was moving forward without her. Children in town grew into teenagers. The marina expanded. New families moved into houses along the shore. Thomas aged subtly, lines deepening around his eyes. One autumn evening, standing again on the back porch, he watched the tide retreat under a sky streaked with fading light. He tried to imagine Evelyn somewhere else in the world, alive, perhaps standing near a different shoreline, looking at another stretch of water. The thought did not feel impossible anymore. It felt unbearable and hopeful at the same time. If she had chosen to leave, he wanted her safe. If she had been taken from him by something cruel, he wanted answers. But more than anything, he wanted clarity. The buoy bell rang in the distance, steady as it had been the night she disappeared. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "I'm still here," he whispered into the wind. The years between 1990 and 1995 did not bring revelation. They did not offer proof of tragedy or confirmation of choice. They offered only endurance. And in that long middle stretch of unanswered time, Thomas learned that waiting could become its own way of living. While Thomas endured the long middle years in Harpswell, Evelyn endured something else entirely. In the winter of 1989, when she stepped out of her car along that narrow access road, she did not feel reckless. She did not feel dramatic. She felt exhausted in a way that sleep had never been able to cure. The decision had not formed in a single instant. It had grown quietly over months, perhaps years, like a crack spreading beneath paint no one thought to examine closely. After their son died in 1984, something inside Evelyn shifted in ways she did not have language for. The grief itself had been expected. People brought casseroles. The pastor visited. Friends spoke gently about God's plan and time's healing. She accepted their condolences with grace. What she did not accept, because she did not recognize it, was the emptiness that followed once the casseroles stopped coming. Thomas grieved outwardly at first, then returned to work with renewed determination. He repaired what he could control. He believed stability would steady them both. Evelyn admired that in him. She depended on it. But inside her, the silence deepened. She began waking in the early hours of morning with a tightness in her chest. Not panic exactly. Not even sorrow. Just a hollow pressure, as though something essential had been removed and not replaced. She told herself it was normal. Mothers were supposed to feel a permanent ache after losing a child. That was proof of love. What unsettled her was not the ache, it was the growing sense that she no longer recognized herself beyond it. Before 1984, she had moved through the world with quiet certainty. She volunteered. She planned dinners weeks in advance. She laughed easily. After the loss, her laughter felt forced, as though she were imitating a version of herself she remembered but could not fully access. On Sundays at church, she caught herself studying other families with children and feeling a flicker of something she did not want to name. It was not jealousy exactly. It was distance. A sense that she stood slightly outside the circle of ordinary life. She tried to compensate by being even more dependable. If she could not be a mother, she would be the most attentive neighbor. The most reliable wife. The most composed presence in any room. Composure became her armor. Thomas noticed her quiet but interpreted it as healing. She encouraged that interpretation. When he asked, "You all right?" she answered, "I'm fine," because she did not know how to say, "I feel like I'm disappearing in plain sight." The small town offered comfort but little vocabulary for mental struggle. People endured. They did not dissect their emotions. Therapy was something mentioned in magazines, not in kitchens overlooking the Atlantic. By 1989, Evelyn's days had become carefully choreographed routines. Wake. Make coffee. Wash dishes. Run errands. Smile at neighbors. Sit beside Thomas at dinner and ask about the boatyard. Inside, however, a quiet question repeated itself. Who am I now? She loved Thomas. That truth never wavered. He was kind, steady, and loyal. He had never raised his voice in anger. He had never made her feel small. In many ways, that made her internal struggle more confusing. If nothing was wrong on the surface, why did she feel as though something fundamental was fractured? There were moments when she would stand at the kitchen sink, hands submerged in warm water, and feel as though she were watching herself from a distance. The woman scrubbing plates moved efficiently. She looked composed. But she felt like a role, not a person. She feared becoming a burden. In quiet conversations with herself, she wondered whether Thomas deserved someone brighter. Someone less shadowed by unspoken grief. He worked hard. He deserved laughter in his home. Instead, he had inherited her silence. The thought tightened around her like a vice. On the morning she left, when she parked the car along the access road, she did not fully intend to vanish forever. She intended only to step away from the weight pressing against her. To breathe somewhere no one expected her to be the strong one. She sat behind the wheel for a long time, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. The winter air seeped through the windshield in pale light. She imagined driving back home. Walking through the door. Resuming the rhythm of the kitchen. The image felt suffocating. She stepped out of the car and closed the door carefully. The quiet around her was vast. No traffic. No witnesses. Only trees and frozen ground. I don't want to die, she thought. The clarity of that realization startled her. This was not about ending her life. It was about escaping a version of it she no longer knew how to inhabit. She walked toward the road that led away from town and accepted a ride from a passing trucker later that afternoon. She gave a different name. Not a lie chosen with cunning, but one spoken impulsively, Grace, her middle name, offered like a small shield. The first nights away were terrifying. She stayed in a modest motel 2 towns over, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding at every unfamiliar sound. Guilt arrived quickly. She pictured Thomas returning home to an empty driveway. She imagined his confusion. For several hours, she considered turning back. But another thought intervened. If I go back now, nothing will change. I will still be empty. I will still be pretending. Over the following weeks, she moved farther west, following seasonal work opportunities that required few questions. She kept her story simple. Widowed. No children. Starting over. Each time she spoke those words, a small part of her winced. She wrote no letter. Not because she wanted to be cruel, but because she feared that if she tried to explain herself on paper, the explanation would collapse under its own inadequacy. How do you write, I love you, but I cannot survive the version of myself I've become? In unfamiliar towns, she began to notice something subtle. The heaviness in her chest eased slightly when no one expected her to perform normalcy. She could be quiet without being interpreted. She could sit alone without someone asking if she was all right. The relief felt both liberating and shameful. At night, she often whispered Thomas's name into the darkness of whatever room she was renting. She imagined him searching. She imagined him angry. She imagined him relieved. The not knowing cut both ways. Evelyn did not view herself as brave. She viewed herself as desperate. Desperate to rediscover a self not defined solely by loss and by the effort to conceal it. Yet even as she attempted to build distance between her past and present, memory followed her faithfully. The sound of the Bowie bell in Harpswell. The warmth of their kitchen. Thomas's quiet voice asking, "You all right?" In the years that followed, she would replay that question often. She had answered, "I'm fine." The truth had been far more complicated. And in the silence between what she felt and what she said, a life had quietly fractured. Evelyn did not arrive in Oregon with a plan. She arrived with exhaustion, a small duffel bag, and the fragile hope that distance might quiet the storm inside her. By the spring of 1990, she had drifted west through a series of short-term jobs, waitressing in Ohio, cleaning rooms at a roadside motel in Nebraska, folding linens in Idaho. She avoided anywhere that felt too settled. Movement gave her the illusion of control. If she kept going, she would not have to explain where she had been. When she reached the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, something in the landscape slowed her. The air was softer than Maine's sharp Atlantic wind. The sky felt wider. Mountains framed the horizon like silent guardians, steady and immovable. She rented a small room above a hardware store owned by an older couple who asked few questions. She introduced herself as Elena Grace Harper. She kept her married name without fully thinking about why. Perhaps she was not ready to let it go. In the beginning, survival was practical. She needed income, routine, structure. She found part-time work at a weekend craft market, helping an elderly woman named Ruth manage a booth that sold handmade candles. The scent of lavender and cedarwood filled the stall, mingling with the hum of conversation and the shuffle of customers moving through the aisles. The first time Evelyn poured melted wax into a mold, she felt something unexpected: focus. The process required patience and attention. The wax had to cool slowly. The wick had to remain centered. The smallest shift in temperature changed the result. It was quiet work. Ruth noticed her steadiness. "You've got good hands," she said one afternoon, watching Evelyn trim a wick with careful precision. "Not everyone can sit still like that." Evelyn offered a faint smile. "I've had practice." The market became her anchor. Week after week, she returned to the same folding table, the same small register, the same scent of melting wax. Customers came and went. Some chatted idly about home decor. Others lingered, drawn by the warmth of the stall. In those early months, Evelyn rarely spoke about herself. She listened instead. Listening was safe. People volunteered their stories easily in the anonymity of a public space. Marriages. Divorces. Illness. Grandchildren. Regret. She realized something quietly profound: everyone carried something unseen. For years in Harpswell, she had believed her internal fracture was uniquely shameful. Here, surrounded by strangers, she began to understand that silence was universal, not personal. The heaviness in her chest did not disappear, but it softened at the edges. She started walking in the evenings along the Willamette River, watching light ripple across the water. It was different from the Atlantic. Less harsh. Less demanding. She allowed herself to breathe without rehearsing conversations in her head. Still, guilt remained a steady companion. At night, when the city quieted, Thomas's face surfaced unbidden. She pictured him at the kitchen table, the newspaper folded neatly in front of him. She imagined him checking the driveway at dusk. The thought tightened her throat. She considered writing to him dozens of times. She even purchased stationery once, cream-colored with a thin blue border. She sat at her small desk, pen poised above the page, and wrote his name. Thomas. The ink blurred as tears gathered in her eyes. What could she possibly say that would not deepen the wound she had already caused? How could she explain that leaving had felt like the only way to survive herself? She folded the blank paper and placed it in a drawer. As months turned into years, Evelyn's identity as Elena became more than a shield. It became a second chance. She learned to blend essential oils with confidence. She began designing her own candle scents: coastal pine, autumn orchard, winter cedar. The act of naming them felt strangely empowering. Ruth eventually retired and offered her a modest share in the booth. "You've kept this place alive," she said warmly. "I trust you with it." Trust. The word lingered. Evelyn accepted, her hands trembling slightly as she signed the paperwork. For the first time since 1984, she felt capable rather than fragile. The market did not demand perfection. It demanded presence. She kept her life small on purpose. A rented room. A modest car purchased secondhand. A routine built around market days and quiet evenings. She avoided deep friendships, wary of questions that might require more honesty than she was prepared to offer. Yet slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to speak more freely. One afternoon, a customer lingering near the cedar candles commented, "They smell like the ocean. Makes me miss home." Evelyn paused. "Where's home?" "Maine," the woman replied with a soft laugh. For a heartbeat, Evelyn felt the ground tilt. The word struck her like a bell. She managed a steady response. "I've heard it's beautiful." "It is," the woman said. "But sometimes you need to leave to understand it." The conversation ended there, but the sentence echoed long after. Sometimes you need to leave to understand it. Evelyn did not know whether she had left to understand her home or to escape it. Perhaps both. By 1995, she no longer felt like a ghost inhabiting borrowed space. She had created something tangible. A small business. A modest reputation among regular customers. A rhythm that did not suffocate her. But reinvention came with a quiet cost. Every new layer she built in Oregon rested atop a foundation she had never fully addressed. She had not confronted Thomas. She had not explained her absence. She had not reconciled the part of herself that still belonged to that gray house overlooking the Atlantic. There were nights when she dreamed of the buoy bell in Harpswell, its steady clang cutting through the dark. She would wake in her rented room, heart pounding, unsure for a split second which coast she stood upon. Reinvention did not erase the past. It only rearranged it. Standing behind her booth at the Saturday market, surrounded by rows of softly glowing candles, Evelyn sometimes watched couples walk by hand in hand. She would feel a flicker of something tender and unresolved. She had not stopped loving Thomas. She had simply stepped away from the version of herself she believed was failing him. Now, years later, as she lit a new display candle and watched the flame steady itself, she wondered quietly whether reinvention was meant to be permanent, or whether it was only a pause before facing what she had left behind. By the year 2000, the world had begun to change in ways neither Thomas nor Evelyn could have imagined a decade earlier. In Harpswell, the harbor still looked the same. The tide still moved in its patient rhythm. But inside the town library, tucked between shelves of aging encyclopedias, four new desktop computers hummed softly beneath fluorescent lights. A handwritten sign above them read, "Internet access, 30-minute limit." Thomas had no real interest in computers. At 53, he trusted what he could hold in his hands: wood grain, engine parts, rope and steel. Technology felt abstract, unnecessary. It was his nephew, Daniel, home from college one weekend, who insisted. "Uncle Tom, you can find anything online now," Daniel said, guiding him through the library doors. "People, records, old photos. It's not just for kids." Thomas gave a skeptical half-smile. "I doubt it can find what I'm looking for." Daniel didn't argue. He simply pulled out a chair and motioned for him to sit. The monitor glowed in front of Thomas, the screen bright and unfamiliar. Daniel typed a few things quickly, then turned the keyboard toward him. "Go ahead," he said gently. "Type her name." For a moment, Thomas hesitated. It had been 11 years. 11 years of waiting without answers. The idea that a machine might hold something the sheriff's department could not felt almost foolish. Still, he placed his hands on the keyboard. Evelyn Grace Harper. The letters appeared slowly, deliberate and slightly uneven as he pecked at the keys. He pressed enter. The page loaded with a quiet mechanical whir. At first, the results seemed unrelated: directory listings, church bulletins, fragments of names that almost matched but didn't quite. Daniel leaned closer. "Try adding Maine." Thomas adjusted the search. Evelyn Grace Harper, Maine. Another pause. More results. Obituaries for different women. Old community announcements. Nothing that felt like her. He exhaled softly. "I told you." But Daniel wasn't finished. "Let's broaden it. Just her name." They tried again. This time, among the scattered links, something new appeared: a small community website advertising a regional craft fair in Portland, Oregon. The page was simple, colorful in a modest way, showcasing vendors and their booths. Daniel clicked it. Rows of thumbnail photographs filled the screen: handmade quilts, pottery, wood carvings. Then one image, small and unassuming, loaded near the bottom. A booth lined with candles in glass jars. A handwritten sign that read, "Elena Grace, hand-poured SOY candles." Behind the table stood a woman. Her hair was shorter than Thomas remembered. There were lines at the corners of her eyes he had never seen before. The photograph was candid, taken mid-conversation, her head slightly tilted as she listened to someone just out of frame. Thomas leaned forward, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't the hair. It wasn't the clothes. It was her eyes. He had studied those eyes across a kitchen table for 17 years. He had watched them fill with grief. He had watched them soften in quiet laughter. "That's her," he said, barely above a whisper. Daniel squinted. "You sure?" Thomas nodded slowly. "I'd know her anywhere." The name beneath the image pulsed in his mind. Elena Grace. Grace. Her middle name. For a moment, the room around him faded. The hum of the computer. The soft shuffle of library patrons. The ticking clock on the wall. All of it blurred into the background as memory rushed forward with startling clarity. She was alive. The realization did not come with triumph. It came with a complex wave of relief and ache intertwined. Alive meant she had not met with an accident. Alive meant she had chosen something. Daniel placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "We can try contacting the organizers," he offered. Thomas stared at the photograph again. She looked calm. Not frightened. Not lost. Just older. Different. Composed in a way he had not seen during those final months before she vanished. For 11 years, he had lived suspended between two unbearable possibilities. Now, a third truth stood before him: she had built a life somewhere else. "Print it," Thomas said quietly. The printer whirred, slowly producing the image on thin white paper. He held it carefully, as though it might dissolve if gripped too tightly. Back in Harpswell that evening, he sat alone at the kitchen table, the photograph resting in front of him beside the folded newspaper. The porch light glowed outside as it had for years. He studied every detail. The curve of her mouth. The slight bend in her posture. The way her hands rested confidently on the edge of the table. She did not look like someone in danger. She looked like someone who had survived. Thomas felt an unfamiliar sensation rise within him, not anger, not exactly betrayal. Something closer to clarity. The waiting had ended. The question of whether she lived had been answered. Now another question demanded space. Why? He reached out and traced the printed name with his finger. Elena Grace. He remembered the morning she had paused in the doorway, watching him with an expression he had not fully understood at the time. Had she already known she would not return? Had she believed he would move on? The buoy bell sounded faintly in the distance, steady against the dark. For 11 years, he had remained where she left him. Now, for the first time, he knew where she was. And the distance between Maine and Oregon no longer felt abstract. It felt bridgeable. The photograph did not leave Thomas's side for 3 days. He carried it folded inside his jacket pocket, removing it whenever he found himself alone. At the boatyard. In the kitchen. Standing on the porch at dusk. Each time he studied her face, searching for signs he might have missed: regret, fear, some visible explanation etched into her expression. There was none. On the 4th morning, he returned to the library. Daniel was not with him this time. Thomas approached the computer alone, moving more confidently now, though his hands still felt stiff against the keyboard. He navigated back to the craft fair website and found a small "Contact Us" link at the bottom of the page. His pulse quickened. He clicked. A simple form appeared. Name. Email. Message. Thomas stared at the blank space for a long moment. For 11 years, he had imagined what he would say if she ever reappeared. Accusations had never been part of those fantasies. Only questions. He began typing slowly. My name is Thomas Harper. I believe one of your vendors may be my wife, who has been missing since 1989. I am not contacting you to cause trouble. I only need confirmation that she is safe. If you can pass along this message, I would be grateful. He paused before adding one final line. Please tell her I am not angry. He read it twice, then pressed send. The days that followed felt different from the waiting he had grown used to. The uncertainty remained, but now it had direction. He was no longer suspended in silence, he had spoken into it. On the other side of the country, in Portland, Evelyn was preparing for the upcoming spring market when Ruth's former assistant, now managing vendor communications, approached her booth. Elena, the woman said gently, holding a printed email. This came through the website. It's personal. Evelyn wiped her hands on a cloth and took the paper. Her breath stopped before she reached the second sentence. My name is Thomas Harper. The market noise faded around her. The scent of lavender and cedar suddenly felt too strong. The letters blurred, then sharpened again as she forced herself to continue reading. Missing since 1989. Not angry. Her knees weakened slightly, and she gripped the edge of the table for balance. He's still looking, she thought. For 11 years, she had told herself that Thomas would eventually rebuild his life. That time would soften the shock of her absence. That he would conclude she had been taken by something beyond his control and find a way to move forward. She had not considered the possibility that he had remained in place, still holding space for her. The vendor coordinator watched her carefully. Do you want me to respond? I don't have to give out your information. Evelyn swallowed. Her voice felt unfamiliar in her throat. Did he leave a phone number? Yes. The paper trembled in her hands. That evening, back in her small apartment, she sat at the kitchen table with the email laid flat before her. The Oregon dusk filtered softly through the window, casting long shadows across the walls. She whispered his name aloud for the first time in years. Thomas. The sound cracked something open inside her. Guilt surged forward, sharp and immediate. She pictured him at the library, carefully typing with fingers more accustomed to wood and rope than keys. She imagined the restraint it must have taken to write "I am not angry." She had prepared herself for confrontation, for accusation, for resentment. She had not prepared for grace. Her first instinct was to disappear again, to close the booth, change locations, retreat further into anonymity. The old reflex of flight stirred quickly. But she was no longer the woman who had stepped out of her car in 1989. Over the past decade, she had built something steady. She had learned to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. She had discovered that silence solved nothing, it only delayed pain. If she ignored this message, she would repeat the same pattern that had fractured her life the first time. She reached for the phone and dialed the number printed at the bottom of the page. Her hands shook so violently she had to steady them against the table. The line rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Hello? The single word carried years of waiting within it. For a moment, Evelyn could not speak. The weight of 11 silent years pressed against her chest. She almost hung up. Hello? Thomas repeated, more cautiously now. She drew in a breath that felt like stepping off a cliff. It's me, she said softly. Thomas, it's Evelyn. Silence filled the space between them. Not the kind of silence she had lived in before, this one was charged, alive, trembling with recognition. On the other end of the line, Thomas sat down slowly at the kitchen table, the same table where he had unfolded the photograph days earlier. Is it really you? He asked, his voice steady but unmistakably fragile. Yes, she whispered. There were 1,000 questions waiting. 1,000 explanations overdue. But in that first fragile exchange, neither of them reached for them. They simply remained on the line, breathing in the presence of a voice that had once been central to their lives. For 11 years, distance had defined them. Now, with a single phone call, the distance had narrowed to the length of a wire stretching across the country. Thomas kept the receiver pressed to his ear as if any movement might cause the connection to break. For 11 years he had imagined this moment in 100 different ways: police officers at the door, a hospital nurse calling with news, a stranger delivering a message on her behalf. He had not imagined her voice, soft and unmistakably real, speaking directly into the quiet of his kitchen. It's really you, he repeated, not because he doubted it, but because he needed to hear the truth settle into the room. Yes, Evelyn said again, her breath uneven. It's me. There was a tremor in her voice he recognized immediately. It was the same tremor she had carried in the months after they lost their son. The sound alone unraveled years of distance. Thomas leaned back in his chair. The porch light glowed faintly through the window behind him. Outside, the harbor lay dark and calm. I saw the photo, he said carefully. From the market. A pause. I didn't think anyone back home would ever see that, she admitted. I wasn't looking for a market, he replied. I was looking for you. Silence followed, heavier this time. On the other end of the country, Evelyn sat at her small kitchen table in Oregon, her free hand pressed flat against the wood to steady herself. She had rehearsed explanations in her mind for years, brief, logical statements that would protect them both from too much emotion. None of them seemed adequate now. How long? She asked quietly. How long have you known? For days, he answered. I wanted to be sure before I reached out. Are you angry? He exhaled slowly. It would have been easier to say yes. Anger was simpler than the layered truth. I was confused, he said at last. I was scared. For a long time I thought something terrible had happened to you. Another pause. Nothing terrible happened, she said softly. Not like that. The distinction did not go unnoticed. Thomas rested his elbows on the table. Then why, Evelyn? He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. The question carried no sharp edges, only exhaustion and the need to understand. She closed her eyes. The moment she had avoided for over a decade had finally arrived. I didn't know how to stay, she said. He absorbed the words carefully. Stay where? In myself, she answered. In that house. In the version of me that was there. Thomas frowned slightly, though she could not see him. You could have told me you were struggling. I didn't know how, she replied, her voice tightening. Every time you asked if I was all right, I thought if I said no, I'd be disappointing you. You were holding everything together. I didn't want to be the one falling apart. You weren't disappointing me, he said quietly. You were my wife. The word lingered between them. I felt like I was disappearing, she continued. After we lost him. I never found my footing again. I kept trying to be strong. I kept trying to be the woman you deserved. And the harder I tried, the more I felt like I was pretending. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. He remembered those months, the way she stood at the sink longer than necessary, the way her laughter seemed thinner. I thought you were healing, he admitted. I thought giving you space was kindness. I know, she whispered. That's what makes it harder. The admission cut gently but deeply. For years, Thomas had replayed that final morning in his mind, searching for signs of betrayal. Now, hearing her speak, he felt something shift. What he had interpreted as distance might have been despair. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you, she said firmly, as though that part mattered most. I left because I didn't recognize myself anymore. I thought if I stayed, I would ruin what we had left. He sat with that for a long moment. You didn't ruin it, he said at last. You froze it. The honesty of the statement surprised even him. On the other end of the line, Evelyn's breath caught. I didn't mean to hurt you like that, she said. I know, he replied. And he did. Anger had flickered in the early years, but it had never rooted itself deeply. What he had carried instead was bewilderment. Did you ever think about coming back? He asked. Every day, she said without hesitation. But the longer I stayed away, the harder it felt. I thought you'd moved on. I thought you'd hate me. I didn't move on, he said. I stayed. The simplicity of the sentence carried more weight than accusation ever could. She covered her mouth with her hand, tears spilling freely now. Why? Because I didn't have proof you were gone, he said. And because I loved you. The line went silent again, but this silence felt different. It was no longer empty. It was full of what had never been spoken. After a while, Thomas asked, Are you safe? Yes. Are you well? I'm better than I was, she admitted. I learned how to sit with things instead of running from them. He nodded slowly, though she could not see it. I'm glad. They did not rush toward promises. They did not attempt to solve 11 years in a single conversation. Instead, they asked smaller questions. What do you do now? I make candles. You always liked working with your hands. And you still at the yard? Every day. The familiarity of their exchanges startled them both. Beneath the years of silence, the cadence of their marriage remained intact. Eventually, the hour grew late. I don't know what happens next, Evelyn said carefully. Neither do I, Thomas answered. But we don't have to decide tonight. He hesitated before adding, I'd like to see you. When you're ready. Her heart pounded at the suggestion. Seeing him meant confronting not only him, but the woman she had been when she left. I need a little time, she said honestly. You've had 11 years, he replied gently. Take a few more days. A faint, fragile laugh escaped her, the first shared laugh in over a decade. I'll call you again, she promised. "I'll be here," he said. After they hung up, Thomas remained seated at the kitchen table long after the dial tone faded. The house no longer felt suspended in uncertainty. It felt altered, alive with possibility. Across the country, Evelyn placed the receiver down slowly. The room around her seemed smaller now, as though the past had stepped fully inside it. For 11 years, silence had defined their story. Now, with a single conversation, the silence had been broken, not by anger, not by accusation, but by truth. And for the first time since 1989, both of them understood that the distance between them had never been hatred. It had been fear. They did not rush the reunion. After the first phone call, there were several more, short at first, careful, almost formal. They spoke in measured sentences, testing the edges of this new connection. Thomas told her about the boatyard's recent expansion. Evelyn described the Saturday market and the way customers lingered over cedar and vanilla in the winter months. They avoided the deepest parts at first, circling them slowly, like people approaching cold water. 2 weeks after that first call, Evelyn said quietly, "I think I'm ready." Thomas did not ask ready for what. He understood. They agreed to meet in Portland, in a neutral place, a small community center near the river that rented out private rooms for meetings. It felt safer than her apartment and less exposed than the market. On the morning of the flight, Thomas stood in his kitchen longer than usual. The house looked as it always had. The same table. The same window overlooking the Atlantic. For 11 years, this space had held only absence. Now he was leaving it, crossing the country toward an answer. He turned off the porch light before locking the door. In Oregon, Evelyn woke before dawn. She stood in front of her closet longer than necessary, uncertain which version of herself to present. The woman from Maine? The woman from the market? She chose a simple navy sweater and pressed her hands flat against it, steadying her breath. She looked older. That fact no longer frightened her. It grounded her. When Thomas stepped off the plane, the air felt softer than Maine's sharp coast. The mountains in the distance seemed almost unreal. He carried no luggage beyond a small overnight bag. This was not a visit. It was a meeting. The community center lobby was quiet when he arrived. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long rectangles across the polished floor. A receptionist directed him to a small room at the end of the hall. He paused outside the door. For 11 years, he had imagined her face in fragments, always from memory. He had imagined shock, anger, tears. He had imagined himself stronger than he felt now. He knocked once and entered. Evelyn stood near the window, her back partly turned. She heard the door open and slowly faced him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Time did not rewind. It did not soften. It simply stood still. Thomas saw the lines at the corners of her eyes more clearly now. He noticed the streak of gray at her temple. She looked both familiar and foreign, like a house renovated but built on the same foundation. Evelyn saw the deepening of his jawline, the quiet heaviness in his shoulders. He looked steadier than she remembered, but also older in ways that tightened her chest. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi," he answered. The word carried more weight than any prepared speech. They stood several feet apart, separated by 11 years of unanswered questions. Neither rushed forward. Neither extended a hand immediately. Thomas was the first to step closer, but slowly, deliberately. "You look, well," he said. "I am," she replied. "Most days." The honesty steadied them both. He stopped within arm's length. "I wasn't sure what I'd feel when I saw you." "And what do you feel?" she asked. He studied her carefully. "Relieved," he said after a moment. "And sad." "And grateful." She nodded, tears gathering but not yet falling. "I was afraid you'd look at me and see only what I did." "I see you," he said simply. The statement landed deeper than apology. For a second, the distance between them felt unbearable. Evelyn reached forward first, not in a dramatic gesture but in a small, uncertain movement. Thomas met her halfway. Their hands touched, warm, real, solid. It was not the embrace of young lovers. It was quieter. Slower. They stepped into each other's arms carefully, as if testing the strength of something long dormant. When they pulled apart, both were breathing unevenly. "I'm sorry," she said, the words finally surfacing in full. "I know," he replied. He did not say it lightly. He meant it. They sat across from each other at a small table near the window. Outside, the river moved steadily, indifferent to reunions and regrets alike. "I thought if I saw you," Evelyn began, "I'd collapse under the weight of it." "You're still standing," he observed gently. "So are you." There was no shouting. No dramatic reckoning. The years had softened sharp edges. What remained was truth. "I stayed," Thomas said quietly. "Not because I was stubborn. But because I never believed you stopped loving me." Her eyes filled. "I didn't. I know." The conversation did not unravel all 11 years. It moved in layers. She told him about the first months in Oregon, the fear, the anonymity, the way candlemaking gave her focus. He listened without interruption, not as an investigator, but as a husband who had waited long enough to hear the full story. "You built something," he said. "I had to," she replied. "Or I would have remained the woman who ran." "And are you still her?" She considered that carefully. "No," she said. "I'm someone who left. But I'm not someone who runs anymore." The distinction mattered. As the afternoon light shifted, they stepped outside and walked slowly along the river. The air was mild, the sound of distant traffic blending with the current. Thomas glanced at her profile. "I kept the house the same." "Why?" she asked gently. "Because I didn't know what ending I was honoring," he said. "Yours or mine?" She reached for his hand again, this time without hesitation. They did not speak about moving back. They did not speak about reclaiming what had been lost. Instead, they acknowledged what stood before them, two people who had changed, who had survived differently, who now faced each other without illusion. As evening approached, they returned to the community center parking lot. "I don't expect everything to reset," Evelyn said quietly. "I don't even know what rebuilding looks like." "Neither do I," Thomas replied. "But I know it starts with honesty." She nodded. "Then let's start there." When they parted for the night, it was not with finality. It was with intention. For 11 years, their story had been defined by absence. Now, standing beneath a sky neither fully Maine nor fully Oregon in feeling, they understood something neither had grasped in 1989. Love had not vanished. It had waited. And waiting, as they had both learned, could be a form of endurance strong enough to survive even silence. The morning after their reunion felt steadier than either of them expected. They met again at the same community center, this time choosing a smaller room with two chairs angled toward each other rather than a table between them. The river outside moved quietly beneath a pale sky. The neutrality of the space mattered. It held no shared memories. No ghosts of kitchens or winter mornings. Thomas arrived first. He sat with his hands clasped loosely, not in tension but in preparation. He had waited 11 years for answers. Now that they were within reach, he realized he did not want them rushed. When Evelyn entered, she closed the door gently behind her and took the seat across from him. There was no hesitation now in meeting his eyes. "Yesterday," she began, "we spoke about what happened. But we didn't speak about why in the way it deserves." Thomas nodded once. "I'm listening." She drew in a slow breath. "I wasn't running from you," she said. "I was running from the feeling that I was failing you." He opened his mouth to interrupt, but she lifted her hand slightly, not to silence him, but to ask for space to finish. "After we lost our son," she continued, "I thought grief would come in waves and then recede. That's what everyone said. That time would make it softer. But it didn't soften for me. It changed shape." Thomas's jaw tightened at the memory. Even after all these years, the loss still lived close to the surface. I woke up every morning feeling like I had lost not only him, she said, her voice steady but low, but also the version of myself who knew who she was. I wasn't just grieving a child. I was grieving the future I had imagined. The woman I had been becoming. He leaned forward slightly. Why didn't you tell me it was that deep? I didn't know how to explain something I couldn't name, she replied. Back then, we didn't talk about depression the way people do now. There wasn't language in our town for what I was feeling. If I said I couldn't get out of bed some mornings without forcing myself, it would have sounded like weakness. If I said I felt hollow even when you were holding me, it would have sounded ungrateful. It wouldn't have, he said quietly. But I believed it would, she answered. You were carrying everything. Working longer hours. Fixing the house. Making sure I didn't have to think about bills or repairs. I saw how hard you were trying to protect us. I didn't want to hand you something you couldn't fix. The word fix hung between them. Thomas looked down at his hands. I did try to fix it, he admitted. I thought if I kept the world steady, you'd find your footing. I know, she said gently. And I loved you for that. But what I needed wasn't stability. It was permission to fall apart. The honesty of it pierced him. I thought falling apart would break us, he said. It might have, she replied. But leaving broke us more. The statement was not cruel. It was clear. Silence settled for a moment, not heavy, but reflective. There were mornings, Evelyn continued, when I stood at the sink and felt like I was watching someone else's life. I'd look at you across the table and think, he deserves someone whole. Someone lighter. Someone who can laugh without forcing it. You think I wanted someone lighter? Thomas asked softly. I wanted you. She held his gaze. I couldn't feel that then. All I could feel was the weight. He leaned back slowly, absorbing the words. For years he had wondered whether she had stopped loving him. Now he understood that love had not been the issue. Shame had been. I didn't leave because I wanted freedom, she said. I left because I thought my absence would hurt you less than my presence. He shook his head gently. You were wrong about that. I know, she whispered. Tears filled her eyes, but she did not look away. I've replayed that morning so many times, she continued. Sitting in the car. Knowing I could turn around. Knowing I could drive back home and tell you everything. But I was terrified that if I spoke it out loud, you'd see how broken I felt. And I couldn't bear that. You were never broken, he said. I felt like I was, she replied. And when someone feels broken long enough, they start to believe the only kindness they can offer is distance. The words landed deeply. Thomas let out a slow breath. All those years, he said, I imagined 100 explanations. An accident. Someone taking you. Even the possibility that you didn't love me anymore. But I never imagined that you left to protect me. I didn't protect you, she said. I abandoned you. You stepped away, he corrected quietly. There's a difference. She studied him carefully. Do you truly believe that? I believe you were drowning, he said. And you didn't know how to ask for help. Her composure finally faltered. Tears slid freely now. I should have trusted you, she said. I should have asked again, he replied. Not just, are you all right, but, tell me what's really happening. The mutual acknowledgement shifted something in the room. For the first time, the past felt shared rather than divided. You've changed, Thomas said after a moment. So have you. In what way, he asked. You're listening differently, she said. Before, you listened to solve. Now you're listening to understand. He considered that. Maybe I had to lose you to learn that. She reached across the small space between them and took his hand. I'm not the woman who left in 1989, she said firmly. I've learned to sit with discomfort. I've learned that silence isn't strength. I've learned that pretending to be fine doesn't make anyone safer. He squeezed her hand gently. And I'm not the man who thought love meant holding everything together alone. They sat like that for a long moment, hands linked, not in desperation but in recognition. There's one more thing, Evelyn said softly. He nodded. I didn't write to you because I believed that if I broke the silence, I'd have to return immediately. And I wasn't strong enough then. It wasn't about forgetting you. It was about not trusting myself. Thomas looked at her steadily. And now? Now I trust myself enough to face what I left, she answered. The truth did not erase the years. It did not undo the nights he had waited by the window or the guilt she had carried across state lines. But it did something more important. It replaced assumption with understanding. I don't know what rebuilding looks like, Thomas said. Neither do I, she replied. But it has to begin with honesty. And this is the most honest I've ever been with you. He smiled faintly. Then we're finally starting. Outside, the river continued its quiet course, unchanged by confession or reconciliation. But inside that small room, something long frozen began to thaw. The truth had not destroyed them. It had revealed that what separated them for 11 years was not lack of love, but fear unspoken. And now, for the first time since 1989, neither of them was afraid to speak. The truth did not solve everything. It did not erase 11 years or neatly stitch together what had been torn. What it did was open a door neither of them had known how to approach before. They did not decide that afternoon to move back in together. They did not promise to resume their marriage as though time had paused and was now resuming on cue. Instead, they made a quieter decision. They would learn each other again. Thomas extended his stay in Portland by 3 days. They spent those days walking slowly, through the Saturday market where Evelyn introduced him simply as Thomas, through the park along the river, through quiet neighborhoods lined with modest houses and early spring blooms. He watched her behind her candle booth with new eyes. She moved confidently, answering questions about wax blends and wick sizes, laughing easily with regular customers. There was steadiness in her posture he had not seen during those final months in Maine. You've built something real, he told her that evening as they sat on a bench near the water. So have you, she replied. You stayed. Staying and building were different forms of endurance. They began to see that neither of them had been idle during the separation. They had both been surviving, just in opposite directions. When Thomas returned to Maine, the house felt different, not emptier, not fuller, but altered by possibility. He called her that night, not out of obligation but out of habit they were forming deliberately. How's the harbor? She asked. Calm, he answered. You'd like it. I remember, she said softly. The conversations lengthened over the following weeks. They moved beyond explanations and into the ordinary details that shape intimacy. He told her about the neighbor's new fence. She described experimenting with a new scent, coastal pine blended with vanilla. Send me one, he said one evening. I will. A small package arrived a week later. Inside was a candle labeled Harbor Memory. He lit it that night in the kitchen. The scent carried a trace of salt and cedar. For the first time in years, the house held something that belonged to both past and present. They began writing letters as well. Not because phone calls were insufficient, but because writing forced reflection. Thomas's handwriting was steady, deliberate. Evelyn's remained looping and careful. In one letter, she wrote, I'm learning that I don't have to be unbreakable to be loved. In his reply, he wrote, I'm learning that asking twice isn't pressure. It's care. The exchange felt like education neither had received in 1989. 3 months after the reunion, Thomas flew back to Oregon. This time, he stayed in a small motel rather than rushing back after a single meeting. They spent evenings cooking simple meals in Evelyn's apartment. The space was modest but warm. Photographs from the market lined one wall. There were no pictures from Maine, but she did not hide that absence. One night, as they washed dishes side by side, Thomas asked quietly, Do you ever think about coming back? She did not answer immediately. The question held weight. I think about what coming back would mean, she said carefully. Not just returning to a place, but returning to a version of us. We wouldn't be that version, he replied. She nodded. Exactly. They were no longer the couple who had shared 17 uninterrupted years. They were two individuals who had grown separately and were now attempting to align again without erasing what those years had shaped. Learning again required patience. There were moments of awkwardness. Once, during a conversation about finances, Thomas instinctively assumed shared decision-making, and Evelyn gently reminded him that her business was hers to manage. Another time, Evelyn withdrew into silence during a discussion about their son, and Thomas recognized it, not as distance, but as grief resurfacing. Instead of retreating, he asked, "What are you feeling right now?" The question would have terrified them both 11 years earlier. "I feel afraid," she admitted. "That talking about him will undo me." "It won't," he said. "We can sit in it together." And they did. They visited a counselor once while Thomas was in Oregon, not because their marriage was failing again, but because they wanted tools they had never been given. Sitting side by side in a neutral office, they spoke openly about communication, about fear, about the generational silence that had shaped them. "We were taught to endure," Evelyn said during one session. "Not to articulate." "And endurance without articulation becomes isolation," the counselor replied. The sentence stayed with them. By late summer of 2000, their rhythm had strengthened. Thomas began discussing the possibility of spending winters in Oregon and summers in Maine. Evelyn considered the idea without panic. The thought of returning no longer felt suffocating because it no longer required her to abandon herself. One evening, standing by the river, she turned to him and said, "If I come back, it has to be as the person I am now. Not as the woman who pretended everything was fine." "I don't want you to pretend," he answered. "I want you present." They did not rush toward a grand decision. They continued learning. How to disagree without retreating. How to express doubt without shame. How to acknowledge that love can survive separation, but only if honesty replaces fear. In Maine, the porch light no longer burned all night. Thomas turned it off deliberately, not because he had stopped waiting, but because waiting had changed meaning. He was no longer waiting for a ghost. He was building a future with a woman who was choosing to step forward. Learning again was not romantic in the cinematic sense. It was practical, patient, sometimes uncomfortable. It required them to confront habits formed in silence. But it was real. For the first time since 1989, their relationship was not defined by what had been lost or what had been endured alone. It was defined by what they were willing to build together, slowly, honestly, without pretending to be stronger than they felt. And in that steady rebuilding, they discovered something neither had understood in their younger years. Love does not survive because it is flawless. It survives because two people are willing to keep learning how to hold it. When Evelyn returned to Harpswell for the first time in 11 years, the town did not greet her with noise. It greeted her with watching. The Atlantic looked the same as it had the morning she left, gray-blue and steady, gulls drifting over the tide as if nothing in the human world had shifted. But the houses seemed smaller now. The roads narrower. Memory had stretched them in her mind, reality restored their scale. Thomas drove her from the small regional airport without speaking much. Not out of discomfort, but out of recognition that this moment needed quiet. As they turned onto the familiar road leading to the house, Evelyn's breath caught. The gray shingles were weathered more deeply. The porch railing had been repaired. The kitchen window still faced the sea. "You kept it," she said softly. "I told you," Thomas replied. "I didn't know which ending I was honoring." He parked in the driveway. For a second, neither moved. Then Evelyn opened the car door. The air smelled exactly as she remembered, salt and pine and something sharp carried in from the water. She stood still, letting the scent settle into her lungs. The house did not accuse her. It did not demand explanation. It simply stood. Thomas unlocked the door and stepped aside. She entered slowly. The kitchen table was the same. The window above the sink framed the same restless ocean. But something subtle had changed. The space no longer felt frozen in time. It felt lived in. You moved the lamp, she said faintly, noticing a small shift near the counter. He smiled. Had to replace the wiring. The detail grounded them both. This was not a museum of loss. It was a home that had endured. News of her return traveled quickly. By evening, neighbors had begun to notice the unfamiliar car in the driveway, the extra light in the kitchen window. In a town as small as Harpswell, mystery did not remain private for long. The first knock came the following morning. Mrs. Callahan from across the road stood on the porch holding a small basket of muffins, her expression caught somewhere between curiosity and caution. "Thomas," she began, then her eyes shifted past him. Evelyn stepped forward. For a moment, Mrs. Callahan simply stared. "Well," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly, "I'll be." There was no accusation in her tone, but there was weight. 11 years of speculation condensed into a single breath. "It's good to see you," Mrs. Callahan added after a pause, handing over the basket. "We weren't sure, well. We weren't sure." "I know," Evelyn replied quietly. Word spread through town within days. Some reactions were gentle. Others were guarded. At the marina, a man Thomas had known for years approached him privately. "You're a better man than most," he muttered. "I wouldn't have taken her back." Thomas did not bristle. He answered evenly. "She didn't leave because she stopped loving me." The man shook his head slightly, unconvinced, but said nothing more. At the church the following Sunday, whispers flickered through the pews. Some faces reflected relief. Others carried thinly veiled judgment. Evelyn felt every glance like a temperature shift in the room. She kept her head high, not in defiance but in acceptance. She had chosen to return. She would not shrink now. After the service, the pastor approached them both. "I'm glad you're safe," he said sincerely. "That's what matters." The simplicity of the statement cut through layers of gossip. Not everyone was kind. One afternoon at the grocery store, a woman Evelyn barely recognized from years ago stopped her near the produce aisle. "People searched for you," the woman said pointedly. "They thought you were dead." "I know," Evelyn replied, her voice steady. The woman studied her, perhaps expecting defensiveness. She found none. "I'm sorry for the pain I caused," Evelyn said plainly. There was no excuse attached. No explanation offered in that aisle between apples and lettuce. Just acknowledgement. The woman's expression softened, if only slightly. Back at the house, Thomas found Evelyn sitting at the kitchen table one evening, shoulders slightly tense. "Hard day?" he asked. She nodded. "They remember the version of me who disappeared. And now they're meeting the version who came back," he said. "Some of them don't want to," she admitted. He pulled out a chair beside her. "We can't rewrite their story," he said quietly. "Only ours." Over time, the town's reaction shifted from shock to adjustment. People grew accustomed to seeing her car in the driveway, to spotting her walking along the shore. She began volunteering quietly again, not to reclaim reputation, but to re-establish presence. Some neighbors asked careful questions. Others avoided the topic entirely. The missing posters had long since been removed. In their place, life had layered new concerns and celebrations. What surprised Evelyn most was not the judgment, but the quiet support from unexpected places. Mrs. Callahan stopped by weekly with garden updates. A young couple newly married asked her advice about grief after learning, in hushed tones, about her past loss. Even the marina man who had expressed doubt eventually nodded to her one morning with a small, respectful tip of his cap. Harpswell did not forget what had happened. But it began to understand that the story had not been about scandal. It had been about silence. Standing one evening on the back porch beside Thomas, watching the tide move in, Evelyn exhaled slowly. "They're watching less," she said. "They're seeing more," he replied. The town's reaction had not been dramatic. It had been human, curious, flawed, cautious, and gradually compassionate. And in that slow adjustment, Evelyn understood something she had not known before she left. Communities, like marriages, do not heal through denial. They heal through presence. She had returned not to reclaim the past, but to stand honestly within it. And Harpswell, steady as the sea beside it, was learning to accept that sometimes the person who leaves is not the villain of the story. Sometimes, she is simply someone who found her way back. By the time autumn returned to Harpswell, the air felt different in the Harper home. Not lighter. Not untouched by history. But honest. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window one evening, watching the tide move in beneath a sky brushed with amber and gray. The buoy bell rang in its steady rhythm, just as it had the night she left, just as it had the night Thomas first realized she was gone. Some things in life remain constant, indifferent to human fracture. The sea does not pause for grief. The seasons do not hesitate for regret. But people can. Thomas stepped beside her, handing her a mug of tea without a word. They stood shoulder to shoulder, not speaking, not performing reconciliation, simply occupying the same space with ease that had once felt impossible. Their story had not been dramatic in the way outsiders might expect. There had been no crime, no betrayal in the traditional sense, no villain to point toward. What had nearly destroyed them had been quieter than that. It had been silence. They had grown up in a generation that believed endurance was virtue. That strength meant not burdening others with your internal struggle. That grief was something to be swallowed, not examined. When their son died, they had both carried pain alone in the same house. Thomas had believed love meant holding everything steady. Evelyn had believed love meant protecting him from the depth of her despair. Both had been acting out of devotion. Both had been mistaken in their method. It is possible to love someone deeply and still fail to let them see your truth. The years apart had not erased their affection. They had revealed how fragile affection becomes when honesty is withheld. Sitting later at the kitchen table, the same table where Thomas had unfolded the newspaper the morning she left, they spoke openly about what those years had taught them. I used to think strength meant not needing anyone, Evelyn said quietly. Now I know it means letting someone witness you when you're not strong. Thomas nodded. I used to think asking once was enough. If you said you were fine, I accepted it. I thought pushing would be selfish. And now, she asked. Now I know silence can be a warning, he said. And love means asking again. Their reconciliation was not about returning to who they had been in 1989. That version of them had been sincere but incomplete. Instead, it was about becoming something new, two people who had learned, painfully, that unspoken fear can erode even the most faithful bond. The town, too, had absorbed its lesson in its own way. Whispers had softened. Judgments had grown quieter. Some neighbors still held reservations, but most had come to understand that Evelyn's disappearance had not been a scandal. It had been a human fracture. Harpswell continued as it always had, boats departing at dawn, church bells on Sunday, winter storms rolling in from the Atlantic. Yet within that familiar rhythm, one house now held a story that challenged old assumptions. Depression was no longer an abstract word in that kitchen. It had a name. It had a history. It had consequences. And it had a second chance. There were still difficult days. There were moments when memory stung sharply, when Evelyn passed the access road where she had left her car, when Thomas noticed how easily 11 years had altered their shared history. They could not recover the birthdays missed, the ordinary evenings lost, the years spent learning alone what they might have learned together. But they did not live in regret. Regret had once driven them apart. Understanding brought them back. One Sunday afternoon, sitting on the back porch as the tide rose, Thomas said, "If I could go back, I would ask you differently." Evelyn turned toward him. "If I could go back, I would answer differently." They held each other's gaze, not with sorrow, but with acceptance. Life rarely grants perfect timing. It rarely offers lessons before mistakes. What it offers, if we are fortunate, is the chance to respond differently the next time. Their marriage had not survived because it was flawless. It survived because neither of them stopped caring. Because Thomas refused to let uncertainty harden into bitterness. Because Evelyn refused to let shame define her forever. Because when truth finally arrived, they chose to receive it rather than defend against it. As evening settled, the porch light flicked on, not out of habit born of waiting, but out of simple necessity as darkness approached. The symbolism was not lost on either of them. Once, that light had burned as a signal for someone who might never return. Now it burned for two people already home. Their story did not promise perfection. It promised presence. It suggested that silence, no matter how long it lasts, can be broken. That fear, once named, loses some of its power. That love, when paired with honesty, can endure distances that once seemed impossible. For anyone who hears their story, the lesson is not about disappearance. It is about conversation. Ask the second question. Answer with the truth, even when it trembles. Do not assume strength means quiet. And if someone you love grows distant, do not mistake silence for stability. Sometimes the most dangerous fractures are the ones no one dares to describe. Evelyn rested her head lightly against Thomas's shoulder as the buoy bell rang in the distance. "I'm glad you found me," she said. He smiled gently. "I never stopped looking." The tide rolled in, steady and unwavering. And in a small gray house overlooking the Atlantic, two people who once lost each other to silence learned that even after 11 years, it is possible to come home, not just to a place, but to each other.